Okay, so this is the economic cycle. We know that economic growth is when real GDP increases, and sometimes real GDP will increase super fast, like in a boom. Sometimes real GDP will increase slower, so you'll have a downturn over here. And sometimes real GDP will decrease. If this continues to decrease for 2 consecutive quarters, we call that a recession. What do I mean by 2 consecutive quarters?
Like two
Like two
quarters in
quarters in
the
the
like
like
financial year.
financial year.
Is that
Yeah,
like
or like a quarter is
Like,
just 3 months. That's all.
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So we look at it from this from now till 3 months. Has it gone up or down in that 3 month period? And then we look at it for another 3 months after that. So if that's gone down for 2 consecutive quarters, then that's called a recession. So boom, downturn, recession, and recovery. Those are the stages of the economic cycle. Um, Tyler, how would I characterize a boom in terms of whether unemployment is high or low and whether inflation is high or low?
Um,
Um,
so at a
so at a
boom,
boom,
unemployment would
unemployment
be
would be
lowering
lowering
as
as
Yep,
there's an
there's an
increased
increased
demand
demand
for
for
workers.
workers.
well done. So specifically, cyclical unemployment would be super low. What about economic growth? That would of course be high. And then what about inflation?
Inflation would
Inflation would
also
also
increase.
increase.
Yeah, it will be on the higher side. So that might be the only thing that's a bit too high. Apart from that, this would be in a good, unemployment would be nice and low, which is good. Economic growth would be nice and high, which is good. However, inflation might be alright or it might be too high. And then a recession will be the opposite. There'll be really high cyclical unemployment. There'll be low inflation or maybe deflation, and there'll be really slow or negative growth. Okay, cool. So the next thing we need to understand is these words right here: positive output gaps and negative output gaps. I want you to think of it like this. Imagine if you've got an economy and the economy is capable. This is how much land it's got and how many workers it's got, okay? So it's capable of producing goods and services using all of this land and all of these workers. If every single one of these workers is working and all of the land is being used and all of the raw materials are being used and all of the machines are being used, that means the economy is working at its capacity. It's doing the best it can. On the other hand, if you've got the same economy, but only a few workers are working, and the rest of the workers are unemployed, and the rest of the machines are not being used and they're getting dusty, and there's raw materials that we could use but we're not using, that means we're not working at capacity, right? So the word for this scenario is a positive output gap, and the word for this scenario is a negative output gap. Okay, so in proper terms, then, a positive output gap is when the actual rate of growth is faster than the trend rate of growth. So if we continued growing at, if we continued at a positive output gap, that would cause stress because we're working too hard at that point. And if there's a negative output gap, that means there's high unemployment because we're not using all of our factors of production. Does that make sense? Perfect. A few, that's all the hard or and interesting stuff to completed then, just a few boring stuff. I mentioned that economic growth is an increase in real GDP. Real GDP is the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. So we might produce £100 billion worth of goods and services every year. So that would be our real GDP. Real means it's adjusted for inflation. Nominal means it's not adjusted for inflation. So there's no point comparing prices in 1970 to prices now because there's been inflation during that time, so it doesn't allow us to compare it accurately. Per capita means per person, so just divide the number by the population. Real GDP, once again, the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. Economic growth, an increase in real GDP. We just talked about this one, and we talked about these two. The final thing then, which is the most important thing I want you guys to remember, is the difference between actual economic growth and potential growth. Tristan, do you know the difference?
Is potential growth when there's a increase in AS, so it's like giving the supplies for an economy to grow, but economic growth is an increase in like AD.
Cool. So let's start with economic growth. We already mentioned it's an increase in real GDP. And the most common way that can happen is if something causes aggregate demand to increase. Okay? It can also happen if short-run aggregate supply increases. That can also cause an increase in real GDP. Okay? You were really close with your answer for potential growth. You mentioned an increase in aggregate supply. We have to be super specific with this one. Potential growth is when there's an increase in long-run aggregate supply. Okay? Or we can say there's an increase in the productive potential of the economy. If we think back to microeconomics, our economy looks something like this. Good X and good Y. And a PPF measures the maximum. So if we go from here to here, we're increasing production of goods and services. That means there's actual economic growth. However, if the PPF entirely shifts out, we're not producing more, but we can produce more. That's an increase in potential growth. Okay, so just to summarize, economic growth is an increase in real GDP, for example, through increase in aggregate demand. Potential growth is an increase in the productive potential of the economy. This is achieved through supply-side policy, something we're about to learn. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Perfect.